forgive me if I spell wrong, Bálint Békefi from King's Evangelical Divinity School, University of Chester. And Bálint will give a talk titled Knowledge and the Fall in American Neo-Calvinism toward a Van Til Plantinga synthesis. Okay, I will now display the talk of Bálint, and we will have a discussion after it, which will be our last discussion after the short lecture, and after this we're going to have a long keynote lecture.
Welcome to this presentation entitled Knowledge and the Fall in American Neo-Calvinism toward the Van Til Plantinga synthesis. The agenda of this talk is to introduce the thoughts of Cornelius Van Til and Alvin Plantinga in the context of American Neo-Calvinism, and argue that their epistemology, with a specific focus on their view of the effect of the fall on knowledge, can be synthesized in a fruitful way. First, in the introductory section, we will take a brief overview of Cornelius Van Til and Alvin Plantinga and introduce their epistemologies. When it comes to Van Til and Plantinga, one way to see them is to see them as the American representatives of Neo-Calvinist philosophy. Neo-Calvinism began as a 19th century Dutch Reformed movement spearheaded by thinkers such as Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck. Their key insight was to see Christianity, and specifically Reformed Christianity, as an all-encompassing world and life view which provided a distinct perspective on every area of life and the academy. In the 20th century, they had representatives and disciples both in the Netherlands and in the USA. In the Netherlands, primarily Herman Dooyeweerd and Vollenhoven, while in the United States, the most prominent ones might be Cornelius Van Til and Alvin Plantinga. Van Til was born in the Netherlands and emigrated into the United States when he was 10. He studied at Calvin College and Princeton Seminary and University and got his doctorate under idealist philosophers. His agenda was basically to formulate a Dutch Reformed apologetic consistent with his theology that interacted with absolute idealism and basically the entirety of the history of philosophy. Alvin Plantinga was born to a family of Dutch immigrants in the States, and he also studied at Calvin, Harvard, Yale, and maybe other places as well. Notably, both of them at Calvin studied under William Henry Jellema, a very highly regarded professor of philosophy. Plantinga contributed to philosophy in many areas, but his most distinct contribution was in epistemology, where he formulated what has come to be known as Reformed epistemology, which is a distinct theory in current analytic philosophy. My thesis in this talk is that there are deep similarities when it comes to the analysis of knowledge between Van Til and Plantinga, and they can be profitably harmonized. First, when it comes to Van Til, one of his key arguments or perspective is considering the antithesis between the Christian and the non-Christian. He argues that in principle, there are two completely opposing worldviews. One is true Christianity and its consistent rejection. The non-Christian worldview, the autonomous worldview, is when someone applies their rejection consistently, entirely antithetical, such that they have nothing in common. Christianity, as the truth, provides the preconditions for knowledge, intelligibility, predication, and other things, and therefore rejecting Christianity renders knowledge and interpretation and intelligibility impossible. However, Van Til also argued that the antithesis is mitigated in practice. The former he called the ethical and the epistemological levels or perspectives, while the second, the metaphysical and psychological. Unbelievers living God's world are created by God, and they are subject to God's common grace, which restrains the realization of evil, such that they do good things ethically and know truth epistemologically to a limited degree and inconsistently with their presuppositions. So they are able to know many things about the world, but they cannot give a coherent account of why they are able to know or why they should trust the deliverances of their reason. Van Til argued that both Christians and non-Christians can and should pursue epistemological self-consciousness, basically reflecting on the influences and consequences of one's worldview presuppositions on epistemological matters. And thus, if an unbeliever becomes epistemologically self-conscious, he will realize that his knowledge is effectively impossible given his worldview. However, the knowledge of God is part of the metaphysics, the constitution of humanity, and therefore, despite the fall, it is not impacted in the sense that everybody knows that God exists, even though unbelievers, because of ethical reasons, suppress or reject that knowledge. Plantinga, on the other hand, sought to formalize his epistemology in interaction with American analytic philosophy. Despite this fact, when reflecting on his philosophical approach, he emphasized Augustinian and Kuyperian considerations of pursuing a distinctly Christian philosophy. His general epistemology, usually known as proper functionalism, defines knowledge as warranted true belief, and Plantinga describes the conditions of warrant in the following way. First, note the general externalist constraint. A belief has warrant if it is produced by properly functioning, reliably truth-aimed cognitive faculties functioning in an appropriate cognitive environment, which is similar to the one that they were designed for. There's an internalist constraint as well on this knowledge, namely that there have to be no defeaters for the given belief for it to be warranted. A defeater is a belief which contradicts or undermines the warrant or rationality of another belief. If this defeater is undefeated, then the other belief cannot be justified. When it comes to religious epistemology, Plantinga has basically two theses. One of them may be called the Aquinas-Calvin model, and the other the extended Aquinas-Calvin model. First, he proposes that humans have a cognitive faculty, which is called the sensus divinitatis, taking the term from John Calvin, which is a cognitive faculty that reliably produces belief in God. Plantinga argues that on theism, this is probable. And second, on Christianity, it is probable that there is a cognitive process called the internal instigation or testimony of the Holy Spirit, which reliably produces beliefs in the distinctives of the Christian gospel and Christian doctrines. When it comes to defeaters, Plantinga has extended arguments arguing against putative defeaters against Christianity and theism. And he also argues that naturalism and evolution may well be defeated. The following is a proposed synthesis in 4 points of Van Til's and Plantinga's perspectives. First, Van Til claims that there is no non-Christian knowledge in principle. He argues that knowledge is impossible in non-Christianity because it is antithetical to the true worldview and therefore cannot provide the preconditions for knowledge. Now, this may or may not be realized by the non-Christian. On reflection, this is probably increased. Plantinga has proposed the evolutionary argument against naturalism, where he argues that the naturalist who believes that humans are the products of evolution has no good reason to believe that our cognitive faculties are reliably truth-aimed and therefore has a defeater for all of their beliefs and therefore has no knowledge. Now, Plantinga is more modest than Van Til in that he argues, or at least thinks, that other religions have a good chance at meeting the preconditions for knowledge and having a correct account of proper function. However, other Plantingians, such as Tyler McNabb, have argued that other world religions face similar defeaters like the evolutionary argument against naturalism. So while there is a specific difference, in principle, a Plantingian could argue the same thesis that Van Til has. There's another implication of the no non-Christian knowledge in principle idea. That is that when the non-Christian in fact has knowledge, that is in some sense dependent on Christianity. Van Til argued that when non-Christians know and claim knowledge, they implicitly presuppose Christianity. And this flows also from Plantinga's account of proper functionalism and his claim that that is distinctly theistic, or at least the only viable model is distinctly theistic. William Lane Craig summarizes this in the following way. The non-theist who thinks that he is warranted in his non-belief thus unwittingly presupposes the existence of God in his very denial of God, for warrant involves proper functioning, and proper functioning entails theism. Moving on, Van Til argued that the sensus divinitatis is a clear, immediate knowledge of God that every human possesses. It is implanted by God and apprehended through creation, and as part of our human constitution, it is not marred by sin, it is universally present in everyone, and the fall only affects what people do with it, namely suppress it. On the other hand, Plantinga argues that the sensus divinitatis, a faculty that often produces knowledge of God, is marred by sin. So it is no longer clear and ubiquitous, but much more tentative and maybe in some individuals even missing. So there are two alleged differences between these two models as laid out by K. Scott Oliphant, a Evangelical scholar. First, that the sensus divinitatis is knowledge itself on Van Til, but merely a cognitive process producing knowledge on Plantinga. But it seems to me that this is a merely terminological difference, since presumably there is some process for apprehending this revelation, even on the Evangelical scheme, and the Plantingian might as well just rename the deliverance of what he calls the sensus divinitatis to call the produced knowledge sensus divinitatis, such that this difference evaporates. However, there is a genuine difference when it comes to its universality and clearness after the fall. There, Van Til and Plantinga disagrees, but either can adapt his own model to accommodate the other. So there is no reason a Plantingian cannot deny this notion of Plantinga and just argue that the sensus divinitatis has remained intact post-fall. When it comes to the knowledge of the world, both agree that it is possible even by unbelievers. For Van Til, the unbeliever is created by God and therefore knows many things, living in God's world. However, if his worldview were true, then he couldn't know anything, therefore he cannot provide a viable account of epistemology. Now, Plantinga argues that unbelievers usually have properly functioning cognitive faculties and therefore their beliefs have a warrant, even though on reflection they might obtain defeaters. However, both agree that this knowledge of the world is limited. For Van Til, describing facts and concepts inevitably includes non-neutral, worldview-dependent interpretation. Whether we think about objects as created and sustained by God goes right down to the definition of terms, and therefore non-Christians' concepts involve some degree of inaccuracy, depending on how consistently they reflect on the impact of their presuppositions. Now, Plantinga argues that non-Christians lack or reject very important pieces of knowledge about the world, such as that it is created by God and that we all depend on God. However, he does not have this element of cognitive or conceptual inaccuracy. It doesn't seem incompatible with Plantinga to argue that even our everyday cognitive faculties are somewhat defective, such that they have this inaccuracy, but he does not propose this specifically. Finally, I wish to propose a model for the use of evidence in apologetics that is consistent with Evangelical principles, even though most Evangelians are reluctant to employ it. The Evangelian dilemma is the following. If evidence is presented on non-Christian presuppositions, that act is inconsistent because non-Christianity does not have a viable standard of reason and of assessing evidence. On the other hand, presenting evidences based on Christian presuppositions are question-begging in the sense that they require Christian presuppositions even to assess them. However, this latter is generally more preferred because of theological commitments, and its apologetic use is left open. My proposal is the following. Given Plantinga's account of proper function, unbelievers, non-Christians, may know many truths that support or imply Christian theism. This is not mere inconsistency, this may well be providential common grace from God, allowing them to know facts which do support Christianity. Now, the apologist has two legitimate options at this point. Either he can launch a transcendental critique to argue that the non-Christian has a defeater for all of his beliefs, or he can make an evidential argument and show how these truths, known by the unbeliever, do in fact support Christianity. There doesn't seem to be any problem with this as long as the Christian believes and keeps in mind that the reason the unbeliever is able to have this knowledge and even perhaps assess it correctly is because the Christian worldview is true and because of providential inconsistency on the part of the unbeliever. Now, should the non-Christian mishandle the evidence or not admit the implications, it is still open for the apologist to revert to transcendental critique. In conclusion, I wish to summarize my points. Since there is a lot of agreement between Bantil and Plantinga, I wish to focus on the differences. My question will be, suppose Evantillian wants to adopt Plantinga's epistemology, what changes should he make to remain consistent with his Evantillian commitments? When it comes to the non-Christian knowledge in principle, the point of disagreement is whether world religions and not just naturalism preclude knowledge. On this point, the Evantillian can readily accept the modifications and extensions from MacNab and others and argue that all world religions preclude knowledge. When it comes to the universal knowledge of God, the disagreement is whether the sensus divinitatis is clear and universal after the fall. On this point, it seems to me that there needs to be a clear modification of Plantinga's views, which is still generally consistent with his epistemology. When it comes to the knowledge of the world, the point of disagreement is whether there is a degree of conceptual inaccuracy when it comes to knowledge by non-Christians. It seems to me that this is an addition to Reformed epistemology, which is not inconsistent with it, but not treated in any sense or in any way by Plantinga and his disciples. Finally, when it comes to the use of evidence in apologetics, my proposal is that non-Christians can be warranted in accepting premises of sound Christian arguments, and the Christian apologist can either draw out these inferences or argue transcendentally.
Thank you very much, Bálint. That was Bálint Békefi from University of Chester, more specifically King's Evangelical Divinity School. Now it's time for the questions. Do we have any questions on site? Or no, I don't see many people here. So the questions from the participants on WebEx. I received already one question on the stream, but we can start with the questions from the participants on WebEx. Do you have any? Just please unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, I can see the question on the chat from Daniel. Bálint, would you mind to read it and answer this?
Sure. So Daniel Spencer asked the following. It seems to me that Plantinga and Bantil both take for granted that there is an agreed upon Christian worldview which logically excludes other systems of thought or world religions. What, according to them, are the distinctive features of the Christian worldview which ultimately ground the epistemological chasm you speak of? In other words, what makes Christianity Christianity? Well, this is a very good question, and I think Plantinga has devoted less thought to this, or at least less writing to this, than Bantil has. For Plantinga, it seems that he has a sort of a mere Christianity approach. He talks about God, he talks about the incarnation, he talks about the great things of the gospel, as he quotes Jonathan Edwards, but he doesn't get into many specifics with respect to what is necessary for a viable epistemology or any such things, which is exactly the reason why he's open to other religions accounting for proper function. On the other hand, Bantil basically takes the entirety of confessional Reformed theology as the most consistent version of Christianity, and he sees several aspects of it as philosophically significant. For example, he takes the Trinity to be the only viable solution to the philosophical problem or problems of the one and the many. Now, this is a very controversial view, but he sees that any worldview which doesn't have an ultimate metaphysical relation between the one and the many fails to account for any meaningful connection of universals and particulars, and therefore fails to account for reason. The other aspect is basically revelation and special revelation. For Evantil, humans are in such an epistemological predicament that we need clear divine revelation to learn things about the world and basically to learn about our own capacities. For Evantil, human reason is limited, and we need revelation to learn about the proper boundaries of human reason. This is what he called the contrast between a univocal and an analogous view, or an analogical view of human reason. For him, revelation sets the boundaries for human reason and allows us to flourish within that and lets us know the bounds beyond which we shouldn't go.
Okay, do we have any more questions from the participants here on WebEx?
Okay, thank you very much for your paper, for your presentation. As to Plantinga, reading him and listening to him, I had an impression that he took too many things for granted as self-evident. Sometimes he doesn't ask maybe obvious but necessary questions. For instance, what does it mean, Christianity? As such, he follows common language intuition, something like that, or the common intuitions. But as to Evantil, I actually would like to follow the one thing that you had said in your comment. It's about Trinity. It's about problem one and many. I'm sorry to ask, but what was the education of Evantil?
Evantil was educated under British absolute idealist philosophers, basically.
Because, the problem of one in many, it's a classical problem of ancient philosophy. You don't need a Trinity, doctrine of Trinity, to basically you can amount the entirety of ancient philosophy to this one question. And you see, it's kind of funny for me how he seems not to know about it.
Oh no, Evantil was very aware of and reflective on the history of philosophy, and he criticized in some depth previous answers to these problems as insufficient.
I'm sorry, but what we have in Trinitarian discourse is not a solution for that problem. I would say otherwise. We have implementation of ancient philosophical solutions to that problem, to the Trinitarian discourse. Not successful, absolutely not successful, but certainly you can take a Trinitarian discourse as any philosophical argumentation that solves the problem of one and many.
Maybe I can clarify what I think Evantil would say. And by the way, if anyone is interested, the most in-depth explanation or exposition of Evantil on this is Brent Bosserman's 2014 monograph, The Trinity and the Vindication of Christian Paradox. So I think Evantil would say that it is just the truth that the one and the many are eternally related in the Trinity. And when philosophers try to reason apart from special revelation, not being aware of this, they basically produce the problem, the philosophical problem, which on the Christian view is just not a problem.
I'm afraid Occam wouldn't agree with him. And not only Occam,
Okay. Can we move to the next questions? We have received two on the stream, and the first question is: in this synthetic model, is the unbeliever's commitment to autonomy rational prior to their acquisition of the features? How does this square with Evantil's view?
That's a good question. So the answer would depend on what the epistemological analysis of autonomy would be. Like, suppose the unbeliever has a belief that his rational capacities are reliable apart from God. Maybe that's an expression of autonomy. I think on this synthesis, one should say that this belief is not the result of reliably true-themed cognitive faculties. In fact, this is produced by, in virtue of the noetic effects of sin, of improperly functioning cognitive faculties, marred by sin, and therefore I think it would be unwarranted. So it wouldn't count as knowledge. But this is, of course, based on Plantinga's external constraints and definition of knowledge. When it comes to internal rationality or justification, that's a more difficult question, but I think one could still say that this is not a basic belief with respect to justification in the sense of not needing any. And on the other hand, there is no good justification for it.
Okay, thanks, Bálint. And the other question we received is, do you know Stephen Law, English philosopher from Oxford, criticism of EAN? EAN is evolutionary argument against naturalism.
I'm vaguely familiar with it. I studied it some years ago. As best I can recall, his argument is basically that even on naturalism, it is quite possible that the neurochemical functioning of our brain, which is basically what is relevant for our evolutionary fitness, it is possible that that is correlated to truth, such that there is some kind of a function so that whenever we have specific types of brain states, those correspond to true propositions, and therefore fitness correlates to our ability to discover truth. I think this is possible. However, the crucial part of this argument is that it has to be probable, because the evolutionary argument doesn't need the naturalist to have a zero probability of his reliability of his cognitive faculties. It needs him to be low, the probability to be low. And I think it's still consistent with Stephen Law's objection to maintain that this probability is indeed low.